This session is recorded and it will be posted on the AAC YouTube channel for all to see afterwards. I am so thankful to all our presenters who are here on this wonderful discussion on feminists and on global development and being free. With this in mind, we have four wonderful panelists today. We're going to start with Dr. Michelle Holder. Michelle Holder is President and CEO of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, as well as an Associate Professor of Economics at John Jay College, City University of New York. Prior to joining the John Jay College faculty, she worked as an applied economist for a decade in both the nonprofit and government sectors. Her research focuses on the Black community and women of color in the American labor market, and her economic policy reports have been covered by the likes of New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Amsterdam News, among many others. Michelle received her MA and PhD degrees in economics from the New School for Social Research and a bachelor's degree in economics from Fordham University. So without further ado, I would sincerely like to thank Michelle Holder and turn the time over to you for your presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Buder. It's a pleasure to be here. And I definitely want to thank the Association for Social Economics for inviting me, and also, for the opportunity to talk today about global development and being free with the other esteemed presenters, of whom I'm honored to be in the company of. As you mentioned, my name is Michelle Holder, and I am the President and CEO of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, which is a DC-based organization that seeks to advance evidence-based ideas and policies that promote strong, stable, and broad-based growth. As you also mentioned, Iris, I'm also an associate professor of economics at John Jay College, which is part of the City University of New York, a public university system, one of the largest in the US. My research focuses on the status of the Black community and women in the American labor market. And in my presentation today, I will discuss the gender wage gap and Black women in the US. To do so, I'll draw on original quantitative research I conducted on Black women and the gender wage gap in the economic report, The Double Gap in the Bottom Line, African-American Women's Wage Gap and Corporate Profits, which I prepared for the Roosevelt Institute in New York City. I must admit the following: I am a labor economist, not a development economist. Therefore, I'm unable to speak about development per se. As folks attending this seminar know, the US, where I'm from, is an advanced capitalist country. But even within the assumed richest country in the world, there is marginalization and disenfranchisement. Given my capabilities and capacities, therefore, I'd like to discuss one group in the US that by many economic indicators is marginalized, and that would be Black women. Black women in the US have among the lowest median earnings, lowest levels of wealth, and highest poverty rates in this country. In this presentation, I will talk about a major contributing factor to Black women's status and position in the American economy, and that is the gender wage gap. The reason I chose to focus on Black women and the gender wage gap is because, from my perspective, as long as Black women continue to be the lowest paid workers in the US, not because they lack necessary job skill sets or education, but simply because of their race and gender, Black women will not be able to achieve true freedom in the US economy, in the sense that they will not have the same access to opportunities and choices as white men in America. Finally, allow me to point out one logistical note with my presentation today. On Fridays, my child care provider is assisting another family. So while I'm conducting this presentation, I'm also watching my 16-month-old daughter, who you might hear in the background. Thus, after this presentation, I will go off camera and mute myself until I return for the Q&A portion. And if during my presentation, I need to quickly and briefly leave to attend to my daughter, I will try to return as soon as possible. Note that I don't plan to use slides for this presentation, but instead just have a discussion and conversation with you all. So to start with, as everyone on this call pretty much knows, I'm pretty sure, the gender wage gap is typically a straightforward comparison of the average or median full-time wages of all working men to all working women. And in this case, I will be focused on the United States. According to the Department of Labor's Bureau of Labor Statistics, women in the US earn about 84 cents for every dollar men earn. Another estimate of the gender wage gap from the Institute for Women's Policy Research, which is also a DC-based organization, Washington, DC, our nation's capital, the US capital, shows that women's median annual earnings are about 81% of men's. However, the gender wage gap formulation masks complex factors which play a role in the gap, including occupational crowding based on sex, gender socialization, employer bias, historical exclusionary practices on the part of unions, the so-called motherhood penalty, and human capital disparities. One prominent narrative that's been advanced regarding the gender wage gap is that it is not due to discriminatory treatment on the part of employers in this country. Instead, the fault lies primarily with women due to voluntary choices we make. This is a narrative. Women choose not to pursue STEM fields in college at the same rate as men. Women, more so than men, choose to stop out in their careers and work life to have and raise children. Women choose occupations that allow more flexibility for parenting obligations, and these occupations are inevitably lower paying. While I don't dispute that women are clearly capable of making informed choices about their work lives, what I hope to show is that even when women seemingly do all the things that should result in equitable pay, there are long-held practices in American work life that leave women vulnerable to unequal pay. If we were to rank median or average annual pay in the US by race and gender, women of color, including Black women, would be at the very bottom of that rank. Black women earn the least due to the effects of both the racial wage gap, which overall is that Black Americans earn on average less than white Americans. This is what's called the racial wage gap in the US, and the gender wage gap. So the dual effects of both affect Black women. I term this dual effect the double gap in wages of Black women. According to the National Partnership for Women and Families, Black women earn about 61 cents for every dollar non-Hispanic or non-Latinx white men earn. The takeaway here is that the gender wage gap has the largest absolute negative impact on the individual earnings of women of color. In original research I conducted using descriptive as well as regression analyses, looking at Black women's employment in the private for-profit sector in the US, such that I excluded in my analysis Black women working in either the public sector or the nonprofit, also known as NGO sectors. Most of the important factors that could contribute to wage differentials between Black women and non-Hispanic white men, such as educational attainment or years of work experience, have been taken into account or controlled for, which means that I compare full-time Black women and non-Hispanic white men with similar educational attainment, similar work experience, and many other commonalities with regard to skill sets. Now, the reason that I compare Black women directly to white men is that, at least by the indicator of wages and salaries, in the US, white men are at the top of the rank and the top of the pecking order. They earn the most on average when compared to all other racial, ethnic, and gender demographic groups. I thus compare apples to apples in this analysis of the wage gap between Black women and white men. What I found was that, with very few exceptions, non-Hispanic white men earn considerably more than Black women in almost all of the 22 major occupational categories in the US and almost all of the 77 minor occupational categories. For an individual Black female worker, the annual wage gap ranges. It can be as low as $5,000 US annually in low wage occupations, or it can be as high as $50,000 to $75,000 US annually in high wage occupations. More or less, on average, I found that in 2019, the annual gap in earnings between Black women and white men ranged between $10,000 to $20,000 US per year for a typical Black female worker in the US. Now, in the aggregate, I estimate that the wages Black women in the US involuntarily forfeit, and I will return to that terminology, due to the gender and racial wage gaps, amounts to approximately $50 billion US per year, which is a large and recurring annual loss to the Black community. The reason I use the term involuntarily forfeit is because, for the most part, in terms of the gender wage gap, women don't know that they are earning less than men with the same or similar skill sets, qualifications, and work experience. In fact, in a lot of the cases where women have sued, claiming and indicating gender discrimination, it's because they inadvertently found out about the wages of a comparable male employee. So these wages that Black women should be earning that they don't are forfeited, but they are involuntarily forfeited. And so that is why I use that phrase. Now, several factors can contribute to the gender wage gap faced by Black women. Contributing factors include Black women's historically subordinate position in the American labor market, the role of networks, differences in college completion rates between Black and white Americans. And I'll note that there is still a large educational attainment gap between Blacks and whites in the US. Over 35% of non-Hispanic whites have a college degree, compared to about 25% of Black Americans. The use of prior earnings history in determining wages, the lack of wage and earnings transparency in the American workforce, and discrimination. Black women, in line with women generally in the US workforce, are crowded into low-wage occupations, in part due to the kinds of occupations that were historically open to Black women. This, of course, has an influence on the magnitude of wage gaps Black women face in the US. Economist Cecilia Conrad noted that prior to the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, particularly Title VII of the Act, which prohibited race and gender-based discrimination in employment, the occupation with the highest share of Black women, 38% in fact in 1960, was private households, i.e. domestic work. Conrad pointed out that by the 1980s, or that by 1980, I should say, the occupation with the highest share of Black women had changed from private household domestic work to clerical occupations. Indeed, in 2015, about 1 in 5 Black women worked in office and administrative support occupations. An additional 17% worked in healthcare practitioner and healthcare support occupations, which includes jobs such as nurses, nursing assistants, medical record technicians, home health aides, and medical assistants. Now, it's also been estimated that about half of jobs in the US are filled through social contacts. One potential explanation for this is such a process for filling jobs can be beneficial for primarily employers at no added human resource cost. Fernandez, Castillo, and Moore conceptualized the richer pool theory, which indicates that by tapping its employees for referrals for company vacancies, employers obtain a better and larger pool of candidates for job openings. Employers can reap other benefits from hiring individuals who are referred to the firm by incumbent employees, including referrals of candidates trusted by employees. Incumbents place their reputation on the line, provide other information about candidates not easily accessed during the hiring process, and help acclimate referral hires to their new work environment. In addition, other research posits that African Americans tend to rely on formal routes in employment. Polster argues that Black Americans are more likely to rely on formal routes to job holding because it's harder for ascriptive characteristics to play an outsized role in hiring, given the professionalization of the human resources occupation. Importantly, other researchers such as Steinbach have pointed out that networks can serve to maintain racially, or gender for that matter, segregated labor markets, since job information is shared through homogeneous networks, leading employers to draw from homogeneous pools. The point here is that given the longstanding exclusion of women and Black men from equal competition in the American workforce, white male networks in the American labor market have an historical and potent reach. Presumably, not only is job vacancy information shared through homogeneous white male networks, but also salary information. Now, there are policy approaches that have the potential to narrow the gender wage gap for Black women. And I'll just briefly talk about a few. Number one, passage of state and or federal laws which prohibit employers from requesting previous salary histories from job applicants. In 2018, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals case, Rizzo versus Jovino, subsequently vacated by the US Supreme Court on a technicality. The common practice of requesting previous salary histories from job applicants was found to be discriminatory against women. Number two, passage of state and or federal laws requiring pay transparency in the private sector. Sorry, I'm just looking at my daughter. Economist Marlene Kim has found that in states where pay secrecy practices are banned, the gender wage gap is lower among highly educated women. 3, revision of the EEO-1 form to include compensation data. This form, required to be submitted regularly by employers, already reports the demographic and occupational makeup of most workers in the US. And this data is used by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in the United States to support civil rights enforcement in the workforce. Under former President Obama, an executive order implemented a revision to the form to include compensation data. But unfortunately, this was jettisoned under former President Trump's administration. I and other advocates such as Jacqueline Fry, formerly of the Center for American Progress, call for this revision to be re-implemented. 4, the likelihood of acquiring student debt is a disincentive to attending colleges. So making tuition free at community and public colleges, such as the one I teach at, throughout the US would incentivize more Black women to complete college, raising this group's median educational attainment level, which will likely narrow the wage gap this group routinely encounters. And number 5, and last, raise the federal minimum wage. The majority of minimum wage earners in this country are women, and proportionally more Black women earn the minimum wage than Black men. Economist Marlene Kim, who I also cited earlier in this presentation, has found a small but positive effect on the gender wage gap is likely to occur by raising the minimum wage. So in conclusion, it's easy to attempt to scapegoat women in general for the wage gaps they endure by asserting that they, as a group, lack, for example, adequate negotiating skills. But it would be incorrect to do so. Research by Gearhart and Ryan, as well as Laura Crothers et al., shows that even when women engage in the same salary negotiating strategies as men, their economic returns are lower. Research also shows that when Blacks attempt to assertively bargain fair salaries, they are perceived as aggressive and risk either losing employment offers or being offered lower salaries for violating employers' expectations when compared to their white male counterparts engaging in the same behavior. For Black women in America to be free, a major requirement is to be compensated fairly and equitably for their work. The burden of shrinking the double gap lies primarily with employers who must recognize and acknowledge that they are underpaying Black women writ large and take measures to rectify this. But CEOs are not going to do this of their own volition. So we need our policy advocates, policymakers, and legislators to push corporate America in the right and fair direction. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a absolutely wonderful and powerful presentation. And thank you again for balancing your childcare needs. So yes, we completely understand that you will go muted. And if you can be back for the Q&A session, that'd be wonderful. If not, we completely understand. So thank you so much. Our next presenter is Dr. Siddiqi, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Psychology, University of Delhi in India. She has a PhD in applied social psychology and has more than 15 published articles to her credit. The key areas of her research interests include gender dynamics, cross-cultural psychology, and generational diversity. Informed by critical feminism, her research focuses on issues such as normalization and promulgation of sexism, gender-based discrimination, and gendered violence. So without further ado, Dr. Siddiqi, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Iris. Thank you so much. And I'm really honored to be here. I mean, it's an honor for me to be sharing this platform with all the amazing co-panelists, and I'm really looking forward to learning a great deal from them. The topic that I'll be speaking on today is gender dynamics in India. And just allow me a moment so I can share my screen. I have a small PPT that I would like to share with everybody. I hope my screen is visible. All right, so this is the topic I'll be speaking on today, and this is a fairly vast topic, and there's a lot that can be discussed around gender dynamics, but I'll be focusing exclusively on the problems that women face in contemporary India, and where do these problems come from. So we'll try to locate the role of, social conditioning and other some similar factors. And towards the end of my presentation, I'll also focus on, how these problems impact women, like their overall sense of identity, their well-being, and work, work family balance, how all of that gets impacted because of these issues, and what, as a society, what exactly we can do to eradicate these problems, to mitigate them at least. So these are going to be the key, points that I would try to cover in my presentation. So let's get started. These are the few problems that I'll be focusing on. This is, of course, not a very extensive list, because there are zillions of other problems that women face in India and across the world, but talking about all of them is definitely not possible given that we have limited time here. So I'll be focusing on the ones which are more pervasive. So I'll start with son preference. And this might surprise a lot of you, especially people from the western part of the world. But son preference is still a big problem in India, and this is more common in rural India, in remote villages where people are not educated and sensitized. And this is basically when people don't want to have sons, or if they already have sons and daughters in the family, they treat them differently, whereby they give preferential treatment to their sons, and their daughters are eventually neglected. So son preference almost always leads to daughter neglect. Now, why is it that we're so obsessed with having a son or treating our sons in a better way? So I've highlighted a few possible reasons here. There can be so many other explanations, but these are again the most common ones. So the whole concept of family honor is closely intertwined with the conduct of female members of the family. So how females carry themselves, how they conduct themselves, and there's particular emphasis on their sexual conduct. So till the time they follow the rules and do what the society expects them to do, they are protecting the family's name and honor. But the moment they are found guilty of transgressing those rules or doing something which is supposed to be socially inappropriate, something which is of sexual nature, or they can be other such actions which are not liked by the society, which are prohibited for women. So if they are engaged in any such activity, the whole family has to face the wrath of the society, and the family's name and honor and prestige is kind of sabotaged. So this is one common reason why a lot of people don't want to have daughters, because they then have to live with a lingering fear of having their family's name lost and tarnished. What is more interesting and surprising is that if a male member of the family does the exact same thing, it is not necessarily seen as an attack on the family's name. So because of differences like these, a lot of people don't they are skeptical of having daughters. So that's one explanation. Then ensuring safety is more difficult. When you have a female member in the family, ensuring their safety is a lot more cumbersome and difficult, given that India is quite high in terms of rape and sexual assault cases. So it could be a real concern for a lot of parents. And I've personally known people who did not want to have daughters simply because they were not psychologically prepared to provide that kind of environment, safe and secure and conducive environment to their daughters. So they would rather not have a daughter in the first place. Then old age dependence is also a real thing. This is basically the notion that in their old age, when the parents reach their old age, it's only the son who can provide for them, who can take care of them. And this is basically because we still follow the conventional gender roles, whereby women are assigned household responsibilities, pretty much everything that the previous speaker spoke about. I think we also follow the same kind of distribution of responsibilities here in India, and men get to do paid work. So financially, men are always independent and women are supposed to be their subordinates. And with that kind of distribution of responsibilities, it makes sense as to why parents don't want to invest too much money on their daughter's education, because the daughter is ultimately going to be married off to somebody else, and she would be financially dependent on her husband and won't be there to take care of them, at least not financially. But as far as the son is concerned, he would be there with them. He would be a financially independent man who can take care of their hospital bills and everything. So in a way, everyone is looking for that return on investment, and it's like a long-term investment, and we're seeing if it is going to be beneficial for you in the long run or not. And this is quite important because I remember the flyer which was shared with all of us had a quote on it which said something along the lines of how important it is to educate women and to basically invest on women's education. And so this point is quite important from that point of view, because a lot of families in India don't want to spend the same kind of resources and the same amount of money on their daughter's education, because they don't see it as a good investment. And moving on to the last point, which is financial burden. So although dowry has been criminalized in India, and it's a legal offense, but still there are communities and sections of the society that continue to practice it. And for those of you who may not know what dowry is, it's an ancient practice where the bride's family is expected to fulfill all the needs, all the demands which are posed by the groom's family, and they can ask for anything, right from cash to property to household appliances, and list can be endless. So it obviously puts a lot of financial burden on the bride's family. So there are families who don't want to have daughters because marrying them off is a lot of work, and you have to spend your entire lives earning on that one event. So that could again be a reason why people don't want to have daughters, and they prefer having a son instead. Now, we've looked at a bunch of reasons as to why son preference still exists, but if there's one thing which is which underlies all these problems, it is our belief in gender roles. Like the whole notion that men and women are naturally suited for different roles, that men should go out and earn money, they should be the breadwinner for the family, and women should stay within the household and take care of household responsibilities. And it is problematic because women then get assigned roles which are not paid. There's no financial independence for women. They're ultimately relying on the male members of the family. So from that point of view, it is a little problematic. So that could be one reason why son preference still continues to exist in our society, because until we change our mindset and start accepting the idea that men and women can swap roles and responsibilities, and that these biological differences don't determine what we are capable of doing, we cannot eradicate these kinds of issues from the society. Now, a lot of research has been done on son preference in particular, and one study which was done by International Center for Research on Women found out that one thing which is important for reducing son preference is educating women. So they discovered that mother's education is the single most significant factor in reducing son preference. So as they say, if you educate a woman, you educate a nation. So if the matriarch of the family is educated, it will definitely have a positive impact, at least at the familial level. And the second thing which is important is media, because media has tremendous power. It has the potential to impact people. It can change our collective outlook and attitudes. So if we can somehow change the way media projects women and start showing more empowered, independent, and successful women in the mainstream media, we can bring about a positive change. And one thing which is not correlated with son preference and what kind of attitudes we hold towards gender equality is wealth and economic development, which explains why even among affluent people and upper middle class families in India, son preference could still be a big problem. So your affluence has nothing to do with your attitudes. The next big issue that I want to cover here is discrimination within the educational space. And this is quite ironic because education is supposed to be the great equalizer. It is supposed to bring everyone together and create some kind of parity by providing the same kind of opportunities to everyone. But there are institutes, colleges and schools where they have discriminatory practices. They have rules which target women or female students in particular. And this is not unique to India. I've come across cases, similar cases that happened in the US and other parts of the world, where female students were accused of distracting male students simply because they chose to dress up in a certain manner. So when these things happen at an early stage, like, these girls are 13, 14, 15 years old. So when they are targeted like this and they are humiliated like this definitely impacts their self-esteem and confidence, and it can have a very negative impact on their overall sense of identity. The other concerning issue is that girls in India are overrepresented in public schools. And this is concerning because public schools are known for poor quality education. And this might sound like a generalization, but that's the ground reality. So there's a basic distinction between public and private schools. Private schools charge a lot of tuition fee. They are very costly, but then they also have cutting edge infrastructure, the best technology and equipment, and the teacher student ratio is amazing. And these things are definitely not there in public schools. And the fact that there are more girls in public schools, it just goes on to show how a lot of parents are willing to compromise on the quality of education that their daughters get. But when it comes to their sons, they want to provide them the best opportunities. And other thing which is related to education is low accessibility and poor infrastructure. Thousands of surveys have confirmed that every year women or young female students drop out of schools in huge numbers the moment they hit puberty. And this is partly because they don't have, the schools don't have proper infrastructure. They don't have separate toilets or clean washrooms for women. Some of these girls don't know about periods. So, they don't even know what's happening to them. There's no proper education. They may not have access to the right kind of products, hygiene products. So these are all, these factors are responsible for them dropping out of school. And also the stigma which is there in our society around menstruation. There are villages in India where women are made to stay outside of the village, and they're not supposed to enter the village until they are clean, because they consider menstruation as something which is unclean and impure. So with all that stigma and these kinds of beliefs, it's very difficult for young girls to understand what's going on and why they are being treated differently, and a lot of them resort to dropping out of schools, which is unfortunate. So that was those were some of the problems that women face within the educational domain. Now coming to work related issues, this has been beautifully covered by the previous speaker, and more or less the same kind of issues are faced by women in India. These are ubiquitous global problems, but if we look at the scale or magnitude at which they are impacting women in India, I am sure India would outrank most other countries. So they are widespread, whether it's glass ceiling or maternity harassment or wage gap. These problems are festering our society in significant ways. And I have included some recent survey findings and reports just to put things into perspective. So as far as workforce participation is concerned, according to some estimates by World Bank, India has the lowest female labor force participation. And the minuscule section of women who are involved in paid work, most of them are low skilled workers like farm and factory laborers and domestic help. So this point has been highlighted by Michelle already. So the scenario is more or less the same for Indian women. Speaking of women in leadership positions, so although 17% of board positions in the corporate world in India are held by women, but only 11% of these women get to do leadership roles. So they are not assigned leadership responsibilities. They are not key decision makers. And this is perhaps because there's a difference between what should be done or what is there in the rule book and what actually ends up happening on the ground. So we do have, laws and rules like this Companies Act, which makes it mandatory to have at least one woman on the company's board. But those laws do not get translated into actual practice level changes. So that discrepancy is there. Moving on to women being hired into senior positions. So I'd like to share, I hope you can see my screen because this finding is quite important. This was done by World Economic Forum, and according to their estimate, it will take us another 36 years time to fill the existing gender gap. And this data is basically based on global, the number of years that they've given. This is coming from global data. For India, I think it is going to take us a lot longer because right now we are lagging behind and we are far from being egalitarian. So while other countries may take 36 years, India will take, I don't know how many more years to fill the existing gender gap. And in the next slide, I have included the global ranking of India versus United States, just to draw a comparison and show you how we are lagging behind in terms of equality. So while US has a rank of 30 out of 156 countries, India's ranking is 140. So we have a lot to do, and we have to, work really, really hard before we can call ourselves an egalitarian society. Moving on to the next big problem that women face in at their workplace, which is maternity harassment. And surprisingly, this is something that has not garnered as much research attention as it should have, because it's a grave problem, it's a grave concern. So maternity harassment is when women who are either pregnant or who have just come back from a maternity leave, they are treated unfairly and with a lot of discrimination by their employer. And this is quite rampant across the world. I have included this one report over here, which was published in nippon.com, which is a very prestigious Japanese media outlet. And so most of the cases of harassment involve unfair treatment. The most common form of harassment that women face at the workplace is unfair treatment, which basically accounts for 54% of all different types of harassments. And this is followed by psychological harassments. And in the second, pie chart, you can see the situation of women at the time of harassment. So 64% of these women who are harassed are pregnant. This is followed by women who have just returned to work, 16% women. So it just shows a pattern or some kind of a trend that women who are either pregnant or who have embraced parenthood or motherhood recently, they are targeted, and the employers want them to quit, and they treat them differently or unfairly, and they basically compel them to quit working because they can't just say it openly. They create those kinds of conditions where women have to eventually leave their organizations and stop working. Now, as far as India is concerned, I could not find any detailed studies or any reports focusing on maternity harassment, but I could, come across these two brief reports. One of them was published in Business Insider India in 2018, which says that employers are unwilling to hire females because maternity leaves which are given to women, they incur huge costs. So this starts happening, right from the time of onboarding and selection. So if there's a female candidate who's planning on having a family, you would be less willing to hire her because you don't want to be spending a lot of money on their maternity leaves. So that is there. And then the other report says that post-maternity attrition has increased by 5% from 40 to 45%. And this is not because, so post-maternity harassment, I hope everyone understands, is when women who have given birth are not resuming their work. So that is post-maternity attrition. And this is not because they want to be full-time mothers or because of other health-related issues. This is purely because they know that they are going to be targeted, they are going to be subjected to humiliation, harassment, and discrimination. And to avoid that humiliation, they stop working. So that has also increased significantly in the last few years. Moving on to violence against women, which is definitely one of the biggest challenges and problems that our society is grappling with right now. And despite the fact that we have made some significant strides towards equality and inclusion, we're still, dealing with this problem. And as per some estimates, gender-based violence affects 27.5 million women only in India. And these numbers are coming from the National Crime Records Bureau. So these are cases which have been officially registered, they have been reported, they're on documents. But then there are thousands, if not lakhs of cases which go unreported because of power dynamics, because of police not cooperating with these survivors, or because of corruption and other issues. So if we include those unreported cases, you can imagine how huge the numbers would be. Now, violence can take place in several different forms, but the most common form of violence that women encounter in India is domestic abuse. So 31% of the cases of violence are committed by a close partner, in most cases the husband. And other than domestic abuse, there are cases of sexual assault, rape, kidnapping, marital rape, because India hasn't criminalized it, so it's a big problem. Then honor killings are also quite common in certain regions, certain areas where people have very strong rules regarding how women should conduct themselves. And we have already spoken about the whole concept of family honor and how the responsibility lies entirely on the shoulders of female family members. So if they are ever found guilty of doing something which is equivalent to compromising with the family's name and honor, the family members themselves brutally murder their daughters and sisters, and they call it honor killings. So this is also, a very concerning issue. Then we have acid attacks. The cases of acid attacks are rising. They have risen significantly over the last few years, and hundreds of women sustain fatal injuries. Some of them die, others have to live with those physical and psychological scars simply because they said no to someone who was approaching them. And and this is also because of the way men are brought up and how they are culturally conditioned into believing that they are entitled and that women are always supposed to be subordinate and subservient to them. So if they ever dare to say no, that no is seen as a personal attack on their masculinity. And then there is female genital mutilation, which is not a very common issue, but there are communities where this is still practiced. And the idea is that if you mutilate the genitalia of young females, you would somehow you can deter them from engaging in unlawful sexual conduct, and you can help them maintain their chastity, and they can remain pious and clean. So that's the whole notion, and it's a very brutal, inhumane and painful procedure, but it still continues to exist. And lastly, there is obstetric violence, and I'm not sure if it is a problem in the Western world, but here in India, a lot of hospitals are found guilty of engaging in obstetric violence. This is when pregnant women who are in labor, they are treated with discrimination, or sometimes they are even emotionally and physically assaulted by medical staff members and even doctors at times. So these are some common forms of violence that women have to experience. Now, in the next slide, we'll talk about how some sections of women are more they are at a higher risk of being oppressed and discriminated against. So while we do know that...
So sorry, one second. So before you talk about the next slides, we need to wrap it up just a little bit, in a few minutes.
All right, I'll just take 5 more minutes if that's okay. All right. So we do know that women have to face a number of issues throughout their lives, but there are certain sections of women who are at a greater risk of being oppressed, and this can be best understood with the help of intersectionality hypothesis. So intersectionality basically says that if you have multiple disadvantaged identities, you would be at a higher risk of being oppressed and discriminated against. So being a woman itself can be a cause of discrimination for me, but then if I'm also from a certain caste or from a marginalized community, I would like my difficulties and challenges would get multiplied. So that's intersectionality, and research also confirms this. So most of the female students who drop out of schools, they are either from the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe groups, or they are Muslim minorities. And similarly, Dalit women, who are supposed to be the so-called low caste women, they are the most oppressed in the world, according to one report published in the BBC in BBC India. And the most common form of oppression that they are subjected to is sexual in nature. So the people who are from upper caste groups, who are also affluent, and they can control the administration and the whole legal process, they basically walk scot-free. There's absolute impunity for them. Nobody ever questions them. And most of these cases have poor conviction and high pendency rates because they exercise that control to silence these women. And also because these women come from such backgrounds that they can't afford to hire a good lawyer, or they can't, spend all their time in pursuing these court cases. So it's difficult for them to get justice, but that's how things are. Now, I'll just try to wrap it up by focusing on some causes, and then we'll talk about how we can deal with these issues. So causes, we have already discussed throughout the discussion. The belief in gender roles, or the idea that men and women cannot swap responsibilities, is one of the leading causes of gender-based discrimination and inequality. So the moment we embrace the idea that men and women, regardless of how biologically different they are, they can still do the same things, and they are capable of doing things which the other gender can, unless we attain that kind of we change our attitudes in that way, we won't be able to create an egalitarian society. And then the whole patriarchal structure is also responsible for creating unnecessary stratification and inequalities, masculine hegemony, and the sense of entitlement that men have in India. So acid attacks, domestic abuse, all of these are a result of this, heightened sense of entitlement. Internalized misogyny is also important, because when women are constantly told that they are less important or they are secondary, their lives should revolve around, their husband or some male member in the family, they also internalize these false notions and they start hating on each other. So women hating other women, or embracing these false notions that we are not as good as men are. That is what internalized misogyny is all about. And then media misrepresentation, how media glorifies casual sexism, stalking, and all of these things. Romanticizing these acts is very, very problematic, and it is very common in Bollywood or in Indian media. Lack of education and lack of financial independence, because if people are educated and financially independent, they can speak up, they can fight for their rights, and they know what their rights are. So that's very important, and the lack of these things is one of the biggest reasons as to why these problems still exist. And lastly, the whole anti-feminist sentiment. I get to see this very often on social media platforms, where people are completely ignorant, and they have absolutely no idea about what feminism stands for, and they have this false notion that somehow feminism is about being anti-men, and they just troll and sometimes even threaten women who talk about equality and justice and equal opportunities. So this ignorance and anti-feminist sentiment is also responsible for creating inequality in our society, because we don't let women speak for their rights. We discourage them, we harass them and threaten them. So those are some of the causes of the power dynamics, gender-based power dynamics that exist in India. Now, in the last few minutes, I'll talk about how these problems impact women and what exactly can be done to deal with these problems. So in terms of impact, obviously they lose their agency because they're not financially independent. So as a society, we believe that women should be assigned only household chores and childcare responsibilities. They are not meant for earning money. If they do it, it's their personal choice, but that's not their primary responsibility. So with that kind of mindset, obviously it's difficult for women to have financial independence, and because of financial dependence on male members, they lose agency in terms of decision making and being part of important activities. They don't have that kind of freedom and latitude. B, their career growth is also obstructed, because the employers are not very keen on hiring women, as we have already discussed. And then there are so many other obstructions and impediments at the work front. So career growth is also obstructed, and they have to prove themselves over and over again, more than any of their male counterparts, simply because they're women. See, their work-life balance is impacted, because we still expect women to balance both the things, and it's it is assumed that it's a woman's primary responsibility to take care of their offspring and household responsibilities. If they are choosing to work, they should learn to manage both the things somehow, and they should be perfect at doing that. But there's no way they can compromise with their family responsibilities simply because they're employed. But the same kind of expectations are not there when we are talking about men. So that, of course.
Nasrina, we are running out of running low on time.
Okay.
So anything that you want to address in the Q&A session, we can do that then, if that's okay.
All right. Can I just talk about the strategies, the
just very
strategies?
quickly, yes.
Quick. Okay. So these are, most of them are very commonsensical points, so I don't think I need to elaborate on them. So education is important, educating women about their rights, and then educating the larger society so they know what their boundaries are, and how to conduct themselves and not be sexist. Then gender neutral parenting, the most basic thing that we can do, is that we can raise our kids in a gender neutral manner, where we don't teach them about these binaries and boundaries. Debunking gender stereotypes and showing people counter stereotypical role models, because if I have someone to look up to, I can get inspired and motivated by them, and women need these kinds of counter stereotypical role models to look up to. And lastly, appropriate and non-stereotypical media portrayals, because media can change mass opinions in significant ways. So showing non-stereotypical women in the mainstream media is also something that's very important, and we can bring about some significant changes if we do all of these. So that was my time. Thank you so much for being patient. Thank you, Iris.
Thank you. All right, so our next presenter is Dr. Strenio. Sorry if you hear a little background noise on my end. Clearly our faculty meeting just got out. So Dr. Strenio is an assistant professor of economics at Norwich University. Her research and teaching interests are in health and feminist economics, and in particular, violence against women. Her research emphasizes that such violence is not only a violation of a person's right to bodily health and a life free from violence, but also can result in other significant unfreedoms, including deprivation of the capability for economic well-being. She earned her MS and PhD in economics from the University of Utah and a BA in economics from the University of Colorado at Boulder. So thank you, Dr. Stenio, for joining us today, and please go ahead.
There we go. Great. Good afternoon or morning or evening, everyone. It's so great to join you here. And thanks for having me, Iris, and the Association for Social Economics. And thanks also to Dr. Holder and Dr. Siddiqi. I'm already making so many connections between our work, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A time when we can start making these connections more formally. So I'm going to spend my time today talking about violence against women and girls from a capabilities approach perspective. Using this framework, I think, helps emphasize that this type of violence can result in multidimensional deprivations. And as an economist, I don't think we can talk about development and being free without focusing on eliminating violence against women and dismantling the patriarchal institutions that enable it, with the caveat that Dr. Holder gave that I am also not a development economist. So we already heard from Dr. Siddiqi about some of these staggering statistics from India, and it's true worldwide that nearly 1 in 3 women and girls have experienced gender-based violence. At the extreme, this includes homicide, but the continuum of violence against women and girls also encompasses more common experiences of sexual harassment at work and in public spaces more generally. All of these forms of violence represent substantial violations of a woman's right to live a life free of violence. But I'll argue that when assessed within a capabilities framework, the consequences of violence or even the threat of violence that most women live with every day gives us a more holistic picture of deprivations. I think from this audience, most of us might be familiar with the capabilities approach, so I'll just discuss it briefly. The capabilities approach was developed by Amartya Sen and expanded upon by many others, including Martha Nussbaum and Ingrid Robbins, who I'll talk about today as well. It's a normative, non-monetary framework that Sen proposed as a means of analyzing and evaluating human well-being and development. Under this framework, the expansion of freedom is considered to be the primary end and principal means of development. And this is distinct from a more resource-based approach to development that might view development as expanding individuals' access to resources, usually money. So the capabilities approach framework means that development requires removing sources of unfreedoms. And I argue that everyday violence or threat of violence that women face is a major source of unfreedoms. Some of the language we use in the capabilities approach to talk about expanding the things that people have the ability to do and be in their lives includes terms like capabilities, which is just the ability to achieve different things of value, where functionings are specific achievements that individuals choose from within their capability set. There's a couple different approaches to the capabilities framework. Sen really envisioned the capabilities approach as just a general framework, but there's alternative perspectives to that. For example, Martha Nussbaum argues that this freedoms perspective is too vague, and instead she proposes a list of 10 fundamental human capabilities that all individuals, regardless where in the world they live, should have the ability to do and to be. Ingrid Robbins proposes a method and a set of criteria for selecting relevant capabilities for a particular purpose. So for example, in this 2003 paper, she lays out a set of criteria to select appropriate capabilities to assess gender inequality in post-industrialized Western societies. As you would imagine, there's a lot of overlap between these two lists. So Nussbaum and Robbins give us these working lists of fundamental human capabilities, which include on both the capability for life and physical health, bodily integrity. For Nussbaum, that means the ability to move freely from place to place, and Robbins calls this the ability to be mobile. We also see central human capabilities, including senses, imagination, and thought, which includes the capability to be educated under Nussbaum's rendering. Emotions, which includes the capability to be free from fear and anxiety. Practical reason, affiliation, the ability to engage in the environment and with other species, the ability to play and have control over one's environment. Robbins, in slightly different terminology, acknowledges these as well. Life and physical health, mental well-being, bodily integrity and safety, social relations and political empowerment, education and knowledge, the capability to engage in paid work and other projects, shelter and environment, mobility, as I mentioned, which will be an important one in this discussion, the capability to engage in leisure activities and have time autonomy, respect, and engage in religion. I want to share some brief insights from recent work I've done on using this capabilities approach to explore the consequences of intimate partner violence in the US, and then discuss some new findings from current work I'm doing with a team of co-authors on public space sexual harassment in India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, although I'll just present results from India and Bangladesh. So Dr. Siddiqi gave us a great overview already of a lot of these different types of violence that women and girls experience all too commonly. Intimate partner violence includes, as she mentions, physical, sexual, or emotional violence perpetrated by an intimate partner. And, you know, it's, as we can imagine, it's a serious and direct deprivation of the capability for bodily health, integrity, and mental well-being. But at the most extreme, it also represents a deprivation of life. For example, in the US, more than half of all women that are murdered by an intimate partner. And something I'll emphasize is the interconnection of capabilities. So I argue that it can be a cause and consequence of deprivations across other of these dimensions or these lists that we've seen. So economic empowerment can be both a protective factor with respect to violence against women, and it can also limit women's ability to engage in paid work or other projects. In a paper in Feminist Economics, I proposed one way to envision this. So what we're looking at here is kind of like a cyclical relationship in which we can see the interaction of IPV and capabilities in kind of all components of this translation of resources into capabilities, into functionings. So when we talk about functionings or specific achievements, we know that they're intrinsically important, the achievements we have in our life. But we also know that particular functionings can provide the resources necessary for the expansion of future capabilities. Intimate partner violence can impact this translation of functionings to resources directly. For example, Bhattacharya in a 2015 paper documented financial exploitation among Indian women by their partners. Or it could be through interfering with a victim's ability to do their job. For example, among a sample of Canadian women, physical intimate partner violence was found to be associated with higher work neglect and increased partial absenteeism from work, according to LeBlanc, Barling, and Turner. We can also imagine that intimate partner violence can directly affect the ability of an individual to convert a resource into real opportunities to do and to be, that is, capabilities. So for example, in the US, an important capability is the ability to be educated. And Dr. Holder talked about barriers we see for Black women to be educated at the tertiary level. A necessary resource is college tuition or a loan. However, even if an individual is able to have the resources necessary to attend college, that might not actually translate into the actual capability to be college educated if we introduce intimate partner violence victimization. For example, a study by Krebs et al. Found that in the US, female college students that reported sexual assault also reported consequences, including dropping classes, changing majors, or leaving the university. Intimate partner violence can also affect the translation of capabilities into functionings. So from a vector of all possible functionings for a given capability, we assume that an individual theoretically chooses a specific functioning that they value or have reason to value. However, intimate partner violence can influence an individual's conception of a good life through adaptive preferences. This can affect personal choice and influence actual achievements. So I think recognizing the role that intimate partner violence can play in constraining capabilities is really important when we think about appropriate prevention and intervention strategies. I briefly want to move on to just talk about some of this new research on public space harassment, which is often trivialized as harmful or a harmless or playful behavior. However, sexual harassment is a form of violence against women, and it operates similarly to these other types of violence I've been talking about, and that it represents a major source of unfreedom. Previous work on public space harassment finds that it's pervasive and does have serious consequences for both victims and society. And this is not just in South Asia, which is what we're focusing on, but pervasive also in the US. For example, a recent study found that over 8 out of 10 women have experienced sexual harassment at some point in their lifetime. With my co-authors, Haimanti Bhattacharya, Gunseli Barrick, Sharon Tallboys, TV Singh, and Ashima Singha, we developed and piloted a survey and then deployed the actual survey to assess the prevalence and consequences of public space harassment in India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. I'll just present data from the first 2 countries here. And we argue that public space harassment generates substantial capability deprivations for women, with economic consequences that not only accrue to them, but have societal ramifications as well. In qualitative responses, women also allude to the fact that public harassment is a restriction of their freedoms. So we deployed these small-scale electronic surveys in 2021, and they are small, which is definitely a limitation. Our respondents were also primarily young, single, highly educated, and urban women, so they were not nationally representative. We defined street harassment or public space harassment based on responses from women to whether or not they experienced any of these behaviors, this list of 12 different behaviors identified on the left. And what we found fits with this existing literature. A large majority of women in our sample in both countries have experienced any types of these forms of public space harassment. Specifically, 89% of women in our sample in India and 91% in Bangladesh reported experiencing at least one of these forms of harassment. In an open-ended question, we find evidence that supported this view of public space harassment as unfreedom. Specifically, I'll talk about some of the significance and specific capability deprivations, but in response to this one question, open-ended question, if harassment no longer existed, how might your life improve? We found, again, a vast majority of women answered in some way, indicating that their freedoms or their capabilities would expand, the things they're able to do and to be. Specifically, we kind of highlight capability deprivations along 4 dimensions, although I should note that most likely public space harassment interferes with each and every capability on lists, whether you're looking at Nussbaum's lists or Robbins' lists. We focus on mobility as a kind of a really important one. And we find that nearly a quarter of women in Bangladesh, respondents in our sample, and a quarter in India indicated that they changed how they got to work. That includes changing their route or their mode of transportation, or having someone accompany them because of public space harassment. We also find significant effects in terms of the capability for mental well-being and emotions. 83% and 93% of the respondents in India and Bangladesh, respectively, who answered these questions about emotional effects resulting from public space harassment reported experiencing some kind of adverse mental health consequence: depression, anxiety, feeling shame or humiliation, fear or anger, including panic attacks, loss of self-confidence, or feeling vulnerable. Further, about half of each sample also reported being fairly or very worried about being a victim of public space harassment in the future. It's not easy, or I mean, it is easy to imagine that these emotional effects have far-reaching implications for the health and productivity of the woman we interviewed. Lastly, these are two big categories that are a little bit cut off, but the capability for senses, imagination, and thought, the capability to be educated and to have control over one's environment, which includes the capability to engage in paid work and earn a livelihood. We saw that, again, nearly 9 out of 10 of our respondents reported reducing or stopping at least one of the activities on the following list as a result of experiencing public space harassment. So using this capabilities approach framework to talk about violence against women and girls, whether it's at the public space harassment end of the spectrum or intimate partner violence end of the spectrum, helps clarify the ways in which eradicating this type of violence can really result in development as envisioned by Sen. So if we, as Dr. Bruder asked us to think about what development means and have conversations about freedom, I would argue that development has to focus on prevention and intervention strategies in terms of eradicating violence against women. This is in line with formal calls like the UN Sustainable Development Goal 5 to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls, which specifically includes as a target elimination of all forms of violence against women and girls. So thank you so much for your time. I'll turn it over to the next presenter.
All right, well, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Next up, we have our last presenter, Dr. Ruwanpura, who is a professor of development geography at the Human Geography Unit at University of Gothenburg. She has her PhD in development studies from Newnham College, University of Cambridge. An important strand in her research is that of global garments, ethical trading, and feminist interests with a regional focus on South Asia. She is the author of 2 monographs, 5 edited volumes, and several peer-reviewed articles on topics around women's livelihoods, war, and disasters. So thank you so much for being here, and go ahead. You can go ahead, sorry. Brain fart.
Thanks, Iris. I'm going to go on first name basis only because that's what we use in this part of the world and also actually in the UK. So thanks, Iris, and also Caroline for suggesting my name and for inviting me here. As Iris said, I'm no longer in economics. I was initially trained in economics and I have since that time moved on. So yeah, economics, PhD with 2 development economists, and since that time moved on to geography. So I was, let me share my screen. Was, as everyone can see that. Yeah. So I was going to be talking, as Iris said, I was going to be talking around my book and what freedom may mean when one is a garment factory worker laboring away for Gap, Levi's, Lilly Pulitzer, H&M, M&S, or any of the merchandises that many of you are wearing, many of us wear on a daily basis, but without really much thought to those who are laboring behind the label. This aspiration, however, I'm not sure how many of you are aware, but has been upended by events in Sri Lanka. And I start with a section of my book, but then the end of my book, but then I kind of veer with a commentary in a sense to understand Sri Lanka. But as Jackie was talking about freedom and unfreedom, I wasn't really thinking of so much in terms of Amartya Sen's work, but it has become very evident to me just watching events in Sri Lanka, the ways in which these freedoms and unfreedoms are really deeply entangled with each other because of the nature of global capitalism itself. So at the end of my book, or towards the end of my book, in the conclusion, I say something to this effect. So that there is a real possibility that the more can manifest in the form of turbulent social political conditions in a bid to kind of resolve unsettled political legacies and militarization that has come about in Sri Lanka with a 3-decade ethnic war and conflict. And I assumed then, I'm not going to read this, I assumed at that point when I was finishing my book, this was in June 2020 or May 2020, that these frictions would be along ethnic lines because this was the dominant vector in the country. Instead, what we have seen what we see happening is a rather different scenario. So I kind of talked about economic freedoms, respect, new futures, etc. And in many ways, what's happening in Sri Lanka is quite, to me, is quite remarkable and also quite hopeful. So I didn't have a crystal ball then, but what is very evident right now is that the expression of anger and wanting both political and economic freedoms are out and very visible on the streets of Sri Lanka. So if anyone has watched, I mean, the NPR picked this up yesterday. This is for those of you who are in the USA. For those of you in the UK, the British press has been picking this up for the past 2-3 weeks. I would say The Guardian, the BBC, and for Nasrina, who is in India, she must be fully aware of what's happening in Sri Lanka because, you know, it's this giant neighbor and we are desperately in need in a sense. So what we broadly have is people coming together irrespective of their ethnicity, and this is the first time in the past past 3 decades of war, coming together in what is called in Sri Lanka Aragalya, which is the Sinhala word for revolution, and not asking not just the political family, which is the 3 of them, to go, but also asking questions about the economic crisis and why we have come to this place. So I want to quickly kind of sketch some key moments to understand what's happening in Sri Lanka and how development freedoms and unfreedoms are inextricably entangled under capitalism. So for those of you in the audience, and I'm not making any assumptions, who might not know what's occurring in Sri Lanka, I offer a brief synopsis to start with. So we've been colonized for something like 450 years. We achieved independence in 1948. And so Sri Lanka has been independent technically for the past 75 years. And yet from 1983 to 2009, we have been also marked by violence, war, and bloodshed. This period had overlapping violent trajectories, and in the interest of time, I'm not really going to go into this other than to note that there was violence that was coming from a left-leaning group in the south of the country, which was very much based a class-based and ethnically based movement, and from the north and the east of the country, which was very much an ethnically based movement. For the past 13 years then, or 12 years, since 2011, we have technically been without war or bloodshed, but the violence, whether it's political or everyday violence, really never went away. Often commentators tended to focus on the political violence, the abductions and the killings, the lack of political freedoms in a sense, emphasizing the ethno-nationalist and religious schisms between the communities, which of course existed, but of course they were also exploited by right-wing politicians that mobilized troops of nationalism and patriotism to keep their interest in place. The emphasis on the lack of political freedoms, however, neglected the economic unfreedoms that also marks Sri Lanka's polity. For instance, if you look at Sri Lanka's inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient, here I'm going back to some economic jargon, it is very evident Sri Lanka's inequality has been rising this same period, which is supposed to be a period of peace, right? So we've gone from 0.364 to 0.577 until 2018. What we know since the pandemic, of course, is that inequality has increased further. In fact, the World Bank has said the absolute poor in Sri Lanka has dramatically increased. Um, um, so, so in terms of course, it's no coincidence. So, in a sense, inequality was on the rise. But the end of the war did not bring equitable development, although economic growth was registered at different periods in time. This, however, is no coincidence because, as David Harvey underlines, capitalism tends to draw a shroud over economic inequality. And the political freedoms or democracy are no longer a necessary condition of capitalism. In his book, A Brief History of Neoliberalism, David Harvey states the profoundly anti-democratic nature of neoliberalism that usually is backed by authoritarianism of neoconservatives that surely should be the main focus of political struggle. And I would want to argue what we see unfolding in Sri Lanka is really a reclaiming of that democratic deficit coupled together with calls for economic justice and equality. While the emphasis of most commentators in Sri Lanka, especially, but also coming from the US, has been on the economic policy mismanagement in the past 2 years, the heightening corruption in the past 2 decades, which is all true, there are also long-standing structural inequalities that have come to the fore. And I'm just going to use two moments of that time in the past 2 years to kind of reflect on this point. First, of course, Sri Lanka appeared to be one of the few outliers globally when the pandemic was declared for managing it really effectively. In fact, for the first 6 months, you will see this year, we were managing our pandemic superbly, right? It changes in October 2020 due to really corruption that occurred between a large-scale manufacturer and the militarized task force. I'm not going to really go into this, but the pandemic also, I think, brought about other freedoms. And this here, I kind of go to some worker testimonies to emphasize this. But even as I do that, I want to point out the pandemic, just like elsewhere in the world, created a lot of unevenness. My colleagues in Sri Lanka or Sri Lankans located elsewhere, like Buddhima Padmasiri, Samanthi Gunawardena, and Nether De Silva has traced some of this. Here, I just quickly want to go through a few worker testimonies to look at how how they made sense of the pandemic. So these are worker testimonies taken from workers that I work with through a labor rights organization in Sri Lanka. We collected some worker testimonies around September 2020. And these are some of the things, what they have to say. Again, all of you can read this, so I'm not going to read this out. But the key message is, of course, that they also had freedom. This moment of a pandemic was also one of freedom. And they talked about how they lived their life and how, in a sense, many ways, how they invested in the sociality of life at that point. So as these PowerPoint quotes show, the spirit of amity, freedom, and camaraderie was high at the start of the pandemic. The freedom to simply be, the freedom to invest in sociality. Workers traced, however, despite this hardships and uncertainty they faced during the pandemic, freedom from daily toil, the freedom they got from no longer having to be in a workplace or from the daily grind was much appreciated. However, this conviviality quickly dissipated when there was recognition that the external support that was supposed to be coming towards them was no longer in existence. Being free and the ability to be free then is deeply entangled with the unfreedoms that came with Sri Lanka's version of capitalism, nonetheless capitalism. Patronage politics around in-kind support meant inconsistencies on the receiving side, struggles to make claims heard, and varied experiences around full or wage payments. So here again, Sri Lanka was really an outlier in much of the global south, certainly in all of South Asia. It came up with a tripartite agreement to make furlough payments to industrial sector workers. This phase, however, also led to sporadic protests that were often on the margins and typically continued to be neglected by the mainstream commentators, policymakers, and politicians alike. It was simply a neglect of unfreedoms that economic poverty places on working class communities. It is this regard, coupled together with the freedom that the pandemic brought to ask questions, to be creative, and find value in alternative life and meaning making, which I want to argue that explains the unprecedented and unified protests taking place in Sri Lanka. It is, I suppose, to quote Marx, Sri Lankans, for the first time in our post-colonial history, have become aware freedom is the consciousness of necessity. Because, as to paraphrase him, necessity has been blind and now it has become conscious. Or to quote one of my feminist legal scholars in Sri Lanka, Dinesha Samaratna, she argues that for the first time, Sri Lankans are undergoing a transformation from being a voting population to becoming citizens with an active enactment of their citizenship rights. This brings with it, of course, the calls for political and economic freedom, or they're actively using their freedom of thought in very visible ways. So this takes me to, I will skip that thing. This takes me to the protests that are ongoing in Sri Lanka. I'm of course deeply conscious that any reflections I offer are refracted by physical distance and mediated by social media, in my case, Twitter and WhatsApp mainly. Hence, I can only offer a sliver of my views and interpretations of an unprecedented public protest now in its fourth week. But if we shift away from a Colombo-centric view of Sri Lanka, which began at least a year ago, a few instances of this if you take kind of a longer view of these protests highlighted: one, escalating costs of living; two, teachers in the public sector protesting salaries that haven't been keeping pace with living wages; three, growing rural indebtedness and the problem of predatory lenders; four, government sector workers protesting erratic wage payments and the rising cost of living; five, an erratic decision made by the president to ban chemical fertilizers and switch to organic farming literally overnight. And I'm actually for organic farming, but the fact is that he made this decision overnight. These are few episodes of protest, and I recall. But however, these were constantly kind of neglected as on the margins, wasn't really that particularly important. However, what has since taken place is that somewhere in around March, the middle class community started neighborhood protests peacefully. It started in the outskirts of Colombo and was in response to something like 13, 14-hour power cuts that were taking place in Sri Lanka. It is these neighborhood sporadic protests that has started to intensify and grow. And from the 2nd of April, what we have seen is a witnessing and a spilling over of different communities protesting and coming together opposite the president's official office. And the other significant thing is, since 1980, yesterday we had, so this is almost more than 4 decades ago, yes, 18, yeah. We had the first nationwide industrial action since 1980 yesterday, right? So in that industrial action, we had people from the north and the east, initially reluctant to join in these protests, eventually becoming part of these public protests. The other important thing, and this is why I start with this image, is that all the religious communities which had been divided before have come together, right? So there are few kind of key things the protests are constantly asking. We want our stolen money back, tax relief for friends, high taxes for local people. These are public nurses protesting. These all images from yesterday. These are garment sector workers from one of the industrial zones in Sri Lanka. Um, and so here what we have is political freedoms are being given expressions, partly due to the economic unfreedoms that have been exacerbated by both local and global factors. The emphasis within Sri Lanka and indeed by outside commentators is of course on the dynastic political regime, and this is rightly justified to a greater degree. However, this focus, while an important aspect of Sri Lanka's political and economic crisis, neglects the current global context of soaring price rises and the country's own integration to the global economy from 1977, the first, in fact, in South Asia. In other words, the history and the nature of global capitalism itself is neglected, and going to the IMF, hence, is considered the panacea, as if we've never been to the IMF before. In fact, we've been doing that for the past 4 decades. Sri Lanka's freedoms and unfreedoms are then so nakedly intertwined that it finds itself in this horrendous place. And I find this personally to some extent troubling because Jackie spoke about Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen's early work really promoted Sri Lanka as an outlier of having of creating the possibilities of high social development comparable to many European countries and low economic growth. So, for instance, Sri Lanka's literacy rates and life expectancy is not just equitable between the genders, and quite in contrast to India, but also, although Bangladesh is catching up, literacy is at 91% for Sri Lankans and life expectancy at 77 years. So it's pretty high, right? These are really impressive indicators these are indicators that could potentially come undone. So I guess somewhere in Sri Lanka's past 4 decades, because of its really close following to some extent of, or not, I would say to a large extent, of open market policies, instead of focusing on national development, which could be socially just, equitable across class, gender, and ethnicity, the country's planners have targeted the means to the goal: economic growth, investment, exports, some in the end, and sometimes at the cost to the goal itself. Hence, I want to kind of end up with these few reflective thoughts. Maybe it is time that we demand taxing and regulating uncontrolled expansion of crony and financial capitalism, which are threats not just to economic freedoms, but also to our political freedoms. If so, we can use this moment to channel resources necessary for what feminists like Titi Bhattacharya, Alessandra Mesadri, Hannah Varghya, who wasn't here today, to fulfill the life-making aspects that is also necessary for capitalism, but has been undermined in the recent past. In short, investors invest in sectors need to sustain ordinary people's livelihoods. Otherwise, as heterodox thinkers like Adam Tooze, Jayati Ghosh, Thomas Piketty point out, the prognosis might very well be that more and more countries in the global south will find that their debts are unsustainable and default, and Sri Lanka could be in many ways the bellwether case right now of which direction we reorient economically post-default, and ask again, of course, for those who are heterodox in the heterodox communities, whether 40 years of neoliberal policies that are past their sell-by date, given that the structure of the open economy is not just a cost on the people, but in the end it seems a cost to itself. I think I will stop there because I'm sure I've taken up my 10 minutes or 15 minutes. It is very cursory. The one thing I want to leave it with is with this image, which is taken from the Times of India, just to show the kind of monumental changes going on in Sri Lanka. What I think the cartoonist misses out, of course, is that we need to kind of have capitalism as the edifice, and whether that itself is being undone right now. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I am just amazed at how all these 4 presentations from very strong women have all meshed so well together, and all the what we've learned from all of this. So thank you all so much. Like I mean, from the capabilities approach to learning about the interpartner violence and inequalities and wage inequities, this is just fantastic. We do have some time for a Q&A session. I will go ahead. So if you want to ask questions in the chat or in person, please let me know. I will go ahead and get us started. So our first question is for Dr. Siddiqi. What role does policy, the legal system, play in the causes of gender discrimination, violence, etc. in India?
All right. So I think rules and legislation and all those legal things are important. But what is also needed is some kind of attitudinal transformation, because I told you about how the whole caste politics and the power dynamics plays out. So people who are in power, who are from so-called upper caste groups, they can exercise power and control. They have the police, at their side. They can control the whole process. So I think what's more important is that we sensitize people, educate them, and bring about some kind of positive change in the way they understand, gender as a construct. So that would be my answer.
Thank you so much. And any further questions or comments? We have 2 participants who raised their hand. Thank you so much. Caroline?
Yeah, hi everyone. I just want to say that this is so exciting. It's been a long time since I've been able to just listen to scholars speak about so many topics that are new to me, but also relevant, and I want to be thinking about, and how it enriches my work. So I wanted to just say thank you for all of that information. I just feel like I've grown so much today. So thank you, each of you. I have a couple, I don't know, Iris, can I ask a question for each person or no?
Yeah.
Just one.
No, go ahead.
So I just want to, I'm going to start with, I'll ask them the 3 questions and then you guys can field them how you like. So I'm going to start with my colleague at IAFI, Kanchana. I really think your book is a tour de force, and it's pretty impressive how you managed to do all of that work. It's just amazing. If people understand the complexity of those kind of factories, it's just really bold work. I just wanted to, it's somewhat of a comment, but I'm interested in, I do work in Haiti, which have a lot of sweatshops and these kind of really frightening factories, often isolated and what have you. But there's a really good documentary by the name of Potomitan, which speaks about Haitian women in this global economy. But what's important here in the story is that how they exit these multinational sort of corporations, and they turn to local forms of organizing and collectivities. They have soul, which is sort of informal mutual aid collectives that they kind of have pushed against formal work to opt for informal work, but through collectives and cooperatives. And I'm just curious to know, on the Sri Lanka side, is there anything like that going on, other than unions, more indigenous sort of, maybe it's Chitu or something, but is there something else that's going on to counter the kind of harms within the formal garment and home-based contracting sector? That's one question for you. For Michelle Holder, is Dr. Holder there? No?
I am here, Dr.
She's there.
Okay.
She's there.
Okay.
She's there.
Yeah, you
She's
can
there.
call me Caroline. So I'm really happy with this idea of thinking through remuneration, particularly for Black women. But I'm going to stretch it a bit, because I'm actually in the process of thinking about remuneration along the lines for people who contribute to community development, who are not captured in care economy work, kind of along the lines of what Dr. Banks is, one of her recent pieces speaks about community activism as work that contributes to society by Black and Latino women, but just is often absent. But I'm actually dealing with something called the banker ladies, who know that they're giving something viable to society in terms of economic development, but are not being compensated. And I'm not sure if your center that you're working on, I know you're looking at the wage aspect, but if there's any consideration of this sort of auxiliary type of work that women tend to do, but is not at all remunerated. And is there a way to think about that kind of work? And then last, I guess, Jackie, your work was amazing. And I don't have a specific question for you, but I just had to say this idea of tying capabilities with gender-based violence is just something very interesting. I may come back to you at another time, just for my personal research. But Dr. Siddiqi, I do have some concerns about your presentation. And I hope that you're going to take it in the spirit of, trying to think through some of these concerns. And my concern was the general speaking of gender in India as this one identity. And I was concerned about the failure to think about intersectionalities there, particularly with what's going on in the Indian context right now. The absolute genocide of Muslim people, the harms that are happening towards Pasmander Muslims, going on against Christian minorities, in particular Dalits, of other faiths. And I'm really concerned about the lack of attention that was paid to women in those stratas and class, because some of the stuff you were saying, it just seemed to homogenize women. And I know a little bit about India, so I had some serious concerns about that research. So I'd like you to address some of that because it seemed problematic to me. Okay.
Right.
That's it.
Can I answer, Carolyn? Can I answer to her question? So that's a very valid point, and I think I did try to talk about intersectionality. There was only because I was supposed to present everything in 15 minutes time, so I could not emphasize enough on how important intersectionality is when it comes to understanding power dynamics or gender dynamics in India. But I did talk about Dalit women and Muslim women. There was also this one case that I wanted to highlight, but again, because of scarcity of time, I could not do that. So something happened recently, like, in 2021, where Muslim women, activists and journalists who would, frequently talk about the communal polarization in India, someone basically created an app where these women were auctioned. So their details, numbers, photographs, they were made public and they were being auctioned. And we know that this was basically to silence them, to tell them that, you don't have the right to speak about these issues and women should, quote unquote, know their place. So issues like these are really important, and I really appreciate that you raised this issue. I wanted to elaborate this point. I wanted to have a detailed discussion on intersectionality and how communal identity, religious identity, caste and class, they all come together and shape your overall experience of oppression and discrimination. But because of having limited time, I could not elaborate on these points. But that's a very good point that you made, and I would make sure that I focus more on this aspect in the future if I ever talk about gender dynamics. Thank you.
Caroline, may I quickly answer Caroline, Iris?
Of course.
Caroline,
Yeah.
thanks a lot for your comments and your very kind endorsements of the book. So in terms of short answer, yes, C2, it's called C2 in Sri Lanka. C2 is what you understood. Yes, that exists. That exists not when workers exit the garment factories. It exists while they're in garment factories, because it is one way in which they develop, as you pointed out, the kind of mutual aid that's ongoing while one is in the formal sector, because work in the formal sector can also be quite precarious. So yes, so the short answer, C2 exists. I haven't written about it. I actually don't know if anyone who's working on Sri Lanka, certainly with apparel sector workers, have written on it, but it exists. I mean, it's quite widespread in Sri Lanka, I would say. Yeah. Michelle, I think.
Thank you, Kanchana. And hi, Caroline. It's so great to see you. And thank you for your question. And I'm glad, I am really glad you posed it, because I think it is an area of my work that I haven't, it's an area that I haven't done a good job of touching upon in my work, because I have been mostly focused on paid work. So I think, you know, my capacity to kind of address your question is hampered by the fact that I haven't really considered the degree to which the fact that women of color, clearly according to Nina's, Dr. Banks's work, and your work, right, do an outsized share of non-remunerated labor in order to support their communities. And this is really long-standing. So I guess what I will say is that I will try harder and do better at drawing the links and linkages between the fact that in paid work, women of color in the US are, you know, regularly exposed to racial and gender inequities, and to somehow make the, you know, the relationship between that and the fact that women in general and women of color in particular absolutely bear this outsized burden of providing unpaid labor to support their communities and families. So that's my response to you, Carol, is that I will do better and work harder at a step, because they're clearly related. So.
Yeah, and I think, sorry if I can just say, Michelle, I'd love to talk to you because I'm working with 3 other African-American women, political economists, who are looking at ROSCAs, will be starting to look at ROSCAs in the US context. So, you know, there's a bunch of us that are keen on this work. So thank you for, even just with equity and growth, your center could be something useful. But thank you.
Thank you too, Caroline. Good to see you.
Wonderful. And Dr. Strenio, do you have any comments and questions or suggestions?
Oh, I have a question, if that's okay. And it's kind of in like just trying to make connections across the presentations and thinking about like the role of formal and informal institutions and enacting like all the change we want to see. And so specifically, because I'm thinking about the US, you talked a lot, Michelle, about like formal institutions that like suggestions. Have in your work, or, you know, have you seen any success stories of informal networks or changes, or do you have suggestions for like informally what needs to change beyond laws?
Jackie, thank you for that question. So I just want to be clear that I understand it, because I did talk about the role of networks, or the lack of the role of networks, right, in terms of improving labor market outcomes for Black women in the US. And so I just want to be sure, is your question about whether or not there are informal networks among Black women in the US that can help improve labor market outcomes?
Yeah, exactly. Like, have you seen things that have like filled this gap? Like, because we hear so much about like the old boys club, like networking, but like, are there alternatives like you've seen?
Oh yeah, there absolutely are, right? There are absolutely networks, not just among the Black community in the US, but among Black women in terms of facilitating information about job openings, facilitating information about, you know, what would be the appropriate compensation level for a particular occupation. But what I wanted to stress in my presentation is that those networks, though they exist, they tend to be weaker than the same networks that are available to white men. Partly because white men have had a longer time to develop these networks, partly because, the unionization movement in this country, as I'm sure everybody at this webinar knows, was quite exclusionary based along racial, gender, and ethnic lines. So there are a lot of factors that go into the reason why white male networks tend to be stronger. But these networks do exist. There are lots of organizations like the National Coalition of 100 Black Women. There are lots of media outlets that Black women can refer to in terms of the American workforce and how to negotiate and how to bargain. And so those things do exist, they just tend to be weaker. And that's really my argument, is that our networks are not as strong or as far reaching or has, the long historical arc that white male networks for, in terms of jobs, those networks possess.
Yeah, thank you. It seems like one of those things, it's such a vicious cycle, because like in my work on workplace sexual harassment, like a lot of the recommendations are, it has to change at the top, like it's a top down, changing the culture. But to get the changes enacted at the top, you have to get the folks to the top that like want to prioritize those changes. And it just seems, sometimes it feels like a vicious cycle.
Yeah, and can I just follow up on this quick note with Jackie? That's absolutely right. And I also argue in the piece upon which this presentation is based is that there's really very little incentive for change to occur at the top, because what I argue is that the gender wage gap for all women, again in the US context, but the double gap for Black women, these gaps in the aggregate translate into tremendous savings for the private for-profit sector, also known as corporate America. So there's very little incentive to change what is happening, at least at the top level. These are savings that are enjoyed by corporate America. Now, how those savings are deployed, it's hard to trace, right? Whether it's increased, dividends for shareholders, whether it is, better pay for upper management, whether it is, deployed as cost savings to consumers. It's hard to trace how those savings are deployed. But what I can say is, for the most part, it is not accruing back to the Black community. And the last thing I'll say, not on this research, Jackie, but on yours, I thought the public harassment and the relationship between that and reduced freedoms for women was amazing. And I wish, 20 or 30 years ago, when I was younger and being harassed more, that I was exposed to this research. I could really understand what the hell it was doing to me as a woman trying to navigate this world. I think that your research is so important, and I'm just mad that you weren't doing this 20 years ago, and I could read it 20 years ago, and I could know, okay, this is how it's destroying my freedom. So thank you for that.
All right, thank you so much. We have another participant who would like to ask a question or make a comment, perhaps.
Hi, everyone. My name is Regine. Dr. Holder, I was actually referred to this webinar by Dr. Gordon Numpart because of a discussion we were having about similar to, I think a little bit about what Dr. Siddiqi and I think someone else was touching on about intersectionality. So my question is, some of I know you weren't able to talk about this much, Dr. Siddiqi, but some of the strategies to address the issues facing women. Dr. Holder, I was wondering if you recognize any of those strategies as strategies that could be used for the trans community, trans Black Black women in the United States. Because a lot of what the struggles that Dr. Siddiqi was talking about, even though, as she was saying, there's a bit behind a few other countries in the struggles that they face, it sounded so familiar, but to a different demographic. And the way you talk about the double gap, I don't know, maybe triple or quadruple gap in that community. So I was just wondering if you found any of those kind of familiar as far as solutions, and even what you were just saying about the harassment aspects of things and how that can be applied to that community as well. Is something I'm really interested in, and figuring out solutions, because as much as it's overwhelming sometimes, the just amount of obstacles that we face as, let's say, just women of color, Black women in the workplace, and then when you think of people who are further marginalized, it's so daunting. So yeah, if you could speak on that a little bit, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Regine, and please tell Jessica I said hey. I unfortunately, after my presentation, I did go first, and I thank Dr. Buder for accommodating me. After my presentation, I did have to go feed my daughter, who is 16 months old. So I missed, unfortunately, a lot of Dr. Siddiqi's presentation, which sounds like it was amazing. So I don't know that I can answer your question because I didn't hear everything Dr. Siddiqi said, but I don't know if she wants to weigh in on this question. No pressure.
Well, I think in India, we are just beginning to have some kind of, discussion or discourse on trans women. So it's quite different. The context is quite different here in India. I'm sure in the US, I would want to believe that the dialogues are much more open and transparent as compared to what's happening in India. There's still a lot of stigma, and people, it's like one of those hush-hush topics that no one wants to openly talk about. And research-wise also, we are lagging behind a lot. But definitely this needs to be, paid attention to, because as you said, they have, one of their identities it could be a cause of discrimination for them. So apart from being a female and a person of of a certain ethnicity, they're also from the they are from the LGBTQ population. So that obviously puts them at a higher risk of being oppressed and discriminated against. And I very briefly, but I did try to touch upon this topic. So yeah, this can be understood from the intersectionality point of view, and we definitely need to have some policies which are specifically tailored for this population, because the ones that we have for women or for women of color, they might not work that well for this particular demographic. So that would be my answer to you.
Thank you so much. And then we have one final question, and for the interest of time, Gio, would you like to ask your question or make your comment?
Yeah, so I first off, I'm speechless. This was really amazing. It's very uncommon for me to see these types of webinars, specifically on the female demographic, and to hear you guys speak out about these types of issues that are going on within the world and to address it. It's amazing, because this is the type of stuff that my mom's been talking about for the past decade, and how she's had issues with these discussions that you guys have had. But overall, amazing work. This is very educational for me as a male to understand the struggles that the female demographic is going through, and what's trying to be adjusted to mitigate all these issues. So overall, amazing work. I love this.
Well, I mean, what a way to wrap that up, right? So thank you, Gio. And thank you everybody for this wonderful panel. I'm so excited it all came together, and appreciate your time, your thoughts, and all your work, and keep moving forward and doing this great and amazing work. And thank you again, and I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your day.